For nearly 6 centuries, a small country on the edge of Europe ruled over territories that stretched across 4 continents, from the rainforests of Brazil to the spice ports of India, from the coasts of West Africa to enclaves in China. The Portuguese Empire was the first truly global empire in history. But how did a nation of fewer than 2 million people at the time become a colonial power with outposts thousands of miles apart? And how did that empire rise, thrive, and eventually collapse? It is a story that begins in the 12th century with the birth of Portugal as a kingdom and unfolds across the medieval crusades, the voyages of discovery, the height of European imperial competition, and finally, the post-colonial revolutions of the 20th century. Along the way, we will explore the motivations that drove Portuguese expansion, the search for trade, religious zeal, political survival, and economic ambition. We will meet the navigators, kings, merchants, missionaries, and rebels who shaped this imperial journey. And we will examine not only the power Portugal wielded, but also the resistance it met and the legacies it left behind. This is not just a tale of conquest and wealth. It is a story of decisions made across centuries of global encounters and of an empire that helped define the modern world long before it vanished from it. Let us begin. The story of the Portuguese Empire does not begin with ships at sea or spices from Asia. It begins on land with a fight for independence. In the early 12th century, what would become Portugal was just a border region in a western part of the Iberian Peninsula, caught between powerful kingdoms and the long struggle between Christian and Muslim forces. In the year 1139, a young nobleman named Afonso Henriques declared himself king after defeating his own mother's forces in battle. At the time, he was Count of Portugal, a vassal territory under the Kingdom of Leon. But Alfonso wanted more than a title. He wanted sovereignty. He led a campaign of military victories against both Muslim-controlled territories in the south and Christian rivals in the north. His most famous triumph came at the Battle of Uric in the year 1139, where he claimed divine favor for his rule. Soon after, he proclaimed himself King of Portugal and began seeking recognition from the Pope and neighboring kingdoms. It took decades, but by the year 1179, the Kingdom of Leon formally recognized Portugal's independence. In the following year, Pope Alexander III issued a papal bull acknowledging Portugal as a sovereign Christian kingdom. This marked the formal beginning of Portugal as a nation-state, the first in Europe to establish nearly its modern borders so early in its history. Geography played a crucial role in shaping Portugal's identity. Bordered by Spain to the east and the Atlantic Ocean to the west, Portugal's land frontier was limited. Expansion inland meant conflict with powerful neighbors. But the sea offered opportunity, an open frontier with fewer rivals, especially in a Europe where maritime trade was still developing. Over the next centuries, the Portuguese began to look toward the Atlantic, gradually shaping a maritime character that would later define their empire. In the 13th century, Portuguese kings focused on expanding southward during the Reconquista, the Christian effort to reclaim territory from Muslim rule. Under King Sancho II and King Alfonso III, Portuguese forces pushed as far as the Algarve, completing the conquest of their modern territory by the year 1249. That same year, a treaty with Castile confirmed Portugal's borders, boundaries that have remained largely unchanged to this day. With the southern lands secured, attention turned inward. In the 14th century, King Denis, also known as the Farmer King, helped develop agriculture, reorganize royal lands, and promote education. But one of his most important contributions came in the realm of navigation. He established the Portuguese Navy in the early 1400s, setting the institutional groundwork for future maritime endeavors. Portuguese society during this period remained largely rural and feudal. The nobility held vast lands, and the church wielded great power. But towns were growing. Lisbon, Porto, and Coimbra began to emerge as centers of trade and governance. Merchants, artisans, and seafarers gained influence. These urban changes would later support Portugal's overseas ventures. Meanwhile, external events also shaped the Portuguese worldview. In the wider Mediterranean, Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa dominated sea trade. Muslim powers controlled much of North Africa and the vital overland routes to Asia. Northern Europe was growing economically and competition for trade routes increased. The Portuguese, isolated at the far western edge of Europe, began to imagine new routes beyond the traditional ones. If they could not control the land paths to the east, perhaps they could sail around them. Culturally, the Portuguese kingdom was deeply Catholic. The crusading spirit of the Reconquista blended with royal policy and national identity. Religion would later justify expansion overseas, framed not only as commerce but also as a divine mission. At this early stage, those ideas were already taking shape. However, challenges remained. The 14th century brought instability. The Black Death arrived in Portugal in the year 1348, killing perhaps a third of the population. Agriculture collapsed in many areas. Labor shortages shifted economic power, weakening the old feudal order. Social unrest grew. At the same time, Portugal was caught in conflict over succession after King Fernando died without a male heir in the year 1383. The crisis led to the rise of the Avis dynasty. Jaime of Avis, a master of a military order, led a nationalist revolt against Castilian claims to the throne. He secured victory at the Battle of Aljubarrota in 1385. This was not just a military win, it was a defining moment of Portuguese independence. John was crowned King John I, marking the beginning of a new royal house that would guide Portugal into its imperial age. This victory had important consequences. It united much of the nobility behind the new dynasty. It also reinforced a sense of Portuguese distinctiveness from Castile. King John I strengthened ties with England through the Treaty of Windsor in 1386. One of the oldest diplomatic alliances still in force today, that Anglo-Portuguese alliance would shape Portugal's future in both European politics and overseas trade. It was during Joan I's reign that the seeds of expansion were planted. He and his queen Philippa of Lancaster had several sons, who became known as the illustrious generation figures who would later lead Portugal's explorations. One of them, Prince Henry, would gain fame as the Navigator. But even before him, the victory at Aljubarrota and the rise of the Avis dynasty created the stability needed for such ambitions. By the end of the 14th century, Portugal was still a small kingdom, but it was independent, stable, and increasingly oriented toward the Atlantic. The sea, once a boundary, was becoming a gateway. At the turn of the 15th century, Portugal was a unified kingdom with stable borders, a growing maritime tradition, and a monarchic house that looked beyond the Iberian Peninsula. The victory at Aljubarrota had secured the throne for King John I and established the Avis dynasty. What followed was not only political consolidation, but also the first steps of Portugal's long journey into global exploration, driven in large part by one man, Prince Henry, later known as the Navigator. Prince Henry was born in the year 1394, the third son of King Joan I and Queen Philippa of Lancaster. As a younger son, Henry was not expected to inherit the throne. Instead, he was given military, administrative, and spiritual roles within the kingdom. But it was his deep interest in geography, navigation, and expansion that would define his legacy. In the year 1415, Portugal launched its first overseas conquest, the capture of the North African city of Ceuta, located on the northern coast of present-day Morocco. Ceuta had long been a strategic and commercial hub for trade between Africa and the Mediterranean world. Muslim merchants traded gold, ivory, spices, and enslaved people through Ceuta's ports. For Portugal, the conquest promised not only religious glory, but access to wealth. Prince Henry played a key role in organizing the expedition to Ceuta. Though the long-term value of the city proved limited, it did not grant direct control over the trans-Saharan trade routes. It marked a turning point. Portugal had projected power beyond its borders. Sudan was the first foothold in what would become a maritime empire. Following Ceuta, Prince Henry settled in Sagres in the Algarve region of southern Portugal. Though the legendary school of sagas may not have been a formal institution, there is little doubt that Henry gathered experts, navigators, mapmakers, shipbuilders, and astronomers to advance Portugal's knowledge of the seas. These efforts coincided with improvements in nautical technology. The Portuguese refined the caravel, a small but highly maneuverable sailing ship that could tack against the wind and handle long ocean voyages. Combined with advances in cartography and the adoption of instruments like the astrolabe and compass, Portuguese mariners could now venture farther into the Atlantic and down the West African coast than any Europeans before them. Prince Henry's ambition was to reach the sources of gold and other riches he believed lay far to the south beyond the Muslim territories that had long blocked overland access. He also had a strong religious motive, the hope of finding Christian allies, perhaps even the mythical Prester John, to support a renewed crusade against Islam. Beginning in the 1420s, Portuguese ships began a slow, methodical exploration of the West African coast. The early voyages were cautious and limited in scope. Sailors feared the unknown. Superstitions about sea monsters and boiling waters still lingered. But over the years, Portuguese navigators pushed further. In 1434, they reached Cape Bojador, a headland once considered impassable. The successful rounding of Cape Bojador in 1435 by Guillainese shattered old fears and opened the door to further exploration. With each new expedition, the Portuguese charted coastlines, established contact with African societies, and began to acquire goods, primarily gold, and enslaved people. By the 1440s, Portuguese ships reached as far as the Senegal River and the Gambia. In 1444, they reached Cape Verde. These voyages were sponsored or encouraged by Prince Henry, who continued to fund exploration until his death in 1460. It is important to recognize that from the beginning, exploration was tied to exploitation. The Portuguese were not simply mapping coastlines. They were engaging in commerce, including the emerging Atlantic slave trade. In the 1440s, the Portuguese began capturing or purchasing enslaved Africans and transporting them to Lisbon. The first public slave auction took place in the city around 1444. This laid the foundation for a transatlantic system of slavery that would expand dramatically in later centuries. Prince Henry himself profited from this trade. While his image as the navigator has often been romanticized, modern historians emphasize that his motivations were mixed: religious, economic, political, and personal. What is clear is that under his direction, Portugal became the first European state to consistently explore and exploit the Atlantic and African coasts. Alongside African exploration, the Portuguese began settling Atlantic islands. Madeira was discovered around the year 1419 and began to be colonized in the 1420s. The Azores followed in the 1430s. These islands, uninhabited at the time, became testing grounds for plantation agriculture, particularly sugarcane. The Portuguese imported enslaved labor from Africa to work these plantations, a model that would later be expanded in Brazil and the Caribbean. The colonization of majors in the Azores was also important for strategic reasons. These islands provided naval bases and stopover points for ships traveling between Europe and Africa. They also deepened Portugal's experience with managing overseas territories, a skill that would become vital in the coming centuries. By the time of Prince Henry's death in 1460, the foundations of the Portuguese maritime empire had been laid. Portuguese sailors had mapped much of the West African coast. They had established trade in gold, ivory, and enslaved people. They had colonized key Atlantic islands and built a growing body of navigational knowledge. Yet at the time of his death, much remained unknown. The southern tip of Africa had not yet been reached. India and the East remained distant and inaccessible by sea, but the direction was clear. Prince Henry had opened a new chapter in Portuguese history, one focused not on the Iberian Peninsula, but on the wider world. His efforts would be taken up by future kings and explorers. In the next section, we follow the dramatic voyages that pushed beyond West Africa, culminating in the historic rounding of the Cape of Good Hope and the arrival in India. In the years following Prince Henry's death, Portuguese exploration did not slow. On the contrary, it accelerated. The dream of reaching India by sailing around Africa became a national project driven by a mix of commercial ambition, religious zeal, and geopolitical necessity. The overland routes to Asia were still dominated by Islamic powers and Italian merchants. Portugal, isolated on the edge of Europe, sought to carve its own path to the riches of the East. King Alfonso V, who ruled from the year 1438 to 1481, continued to sponsor expeditions down the African coast. Under his reign, Portuguese navigators reached the Gulf of Guinea and established trade with local African kingdoms. These early missions returned with gold, dust, ivory, pepper, and enslaved people. But the deeper goal, finding the sea route to India, remained elusive. In 1471, a significant figure emerged: Fern Gomez, a Lisbon merchant who leased the rights to explore parts of the African coast in exchange for promises of discovery and tribute. His private expeditions reached what is now modern Ghana, encountering the rich gold trade of the Akan people. The Portuguese named the area the Gold Coast, and it became one of their first profitable commercial zones in Africa. Meanwhile, the crown continued to refine its maritime policies. King John II, who began his reign in the year 1481, took a more direct and aggressive approach. Known as the Perfect Prince, Jamin was determined to assert royal control over exploration and to complete the route to India. One of Jam's first acts was to reform navigation and mapping. He gathered new information from returning sailors and commissioned better charts. He also promoted the use of the padrón, stone markers placed by Portuguese navigators along the African coast to claim territory and record their presence. In the year 1488, a breakthrough came. Bartolomeu, a Portuguese nobleman and experienced navigator, was tasked with leading an expedition to push beyond the known southern limits of Africa. He sailed with 3 ships following the West African coast and then heading further south than any previous voyage. Das's fleet encountered severe storms and was blown far out to sea. When they turned back toward the coast, they discovered they had passed the southern tip of Africa. In other words, they had gone beyond the continent and were now on the eastern side. This was a monumental moment. It proved for the first time that the Atlantic and Indian Oceans were connected by water, that Africa could indeed be circumnavigated. On the return journey, Das identified the southern cape, which he named the Cape of Storms due to the dangerous weather. King John II later renamed it the Cape of Good Hope, signaling the optimism that now surrounded Portuguese exploration. A sea route to India was no longer just a dream. It was within reach. However, the journey itself was not yet complete. Das had turned back before reaching India, and many questions remained. How far was India from the Cape? What lands lay beyond? What political powers would the Portuguese encounter? By this time, news of Portuguese achievements had reached other parts of Europe. Spain, in particular, began to respond. In the year 1492, Christopher Columbus, sailing under the Castilian flag, reached the Americas while attempting to find a western route to Asia. This development created a sense of urgency for the Portuguese crown. King Manuel I, who succeeded John II in 1495, inherited the task of completing the Indian Ocean voyage known as Manuel the Fortunate. He chose a skilled and ambitious navigator to lead the expedition, Vasco da Gama. Vasco da Gama came from a noble family in southern Portugal. He was well versed in mathematics and navigation and had previously worked on enforcing royal authority along the Portuguese coast. In 1497, he was given command of a fleet of 4 ships and tasked with reaching India by sailing around Africa. The expedition departed Lisbon in the summer of 1497. It followed the established route along the West African coast, rounded the Cape of Good Hope in early 1498, and continued up the eastern African coast. Along the way, da Gama stopped at trading cities like Mozambique and Mombasa, where he encountered the Swahili culture, a mix of African, Arab, and Persian influences. In Melinda, a local sultan provided da Gama with a crucial ally, an experienced pilot, likely of Arab or Indian origin, who helped guide the fleet across the Indian Ocean using monsoon winds. In May of 1498, da Gama and his fleet arrived at Calicut, a major trading city on the southwestern coast of India. The arrival was historic. For the first time, a European fleet had reached India by sea. But the encounter was not entirely smooth. The local ruler, known as the Zamorin, received da Gama but was unimpressed by the Portuguese gifts. Negotiations over trade terms were tense and cultural misunderstandings abounded. Still, da Gama managed to secure a limited trading agreement and returned to Portugal in the summer of 1499. The voyage took over 2 years and cost the lives of many crew members, mostly to scurvy and other diseases. But it was considered a triumph. King Manuel celebrated da Gama as a hero. The sea route to India had been established, and with it came enormous possibilities for trade in spices, textiles, and precious stones. The overland routes controlled by Muslim and Venetian traders could now be bypassed. Portugal had positioned itself as a direct link between Europe and Asia. Vasco da Gama's journey marked the beginning of a new era, not only for Portugal, but for the world. The balance of global trade was shifting. Europe's connection to Asia was no longer limited to slow, expensive land routes, and Portugal, a small kingdom on the western edge of the continent, had made that transformation possible through persistence, innovation, and calculated risk. The consequences would be profound. Trade would grow, competition would intensify, and conflict would become inevitable. In the next section, we explore how Portugal moved quickly to protect its new sea route and build an empire in the Indian Ocean. With a sea route to India secured by Vasco da Gama at the end of the 15th century, Portugal stood at the threshold of a vast and unfamiliar world. Spices such as pepper, cinnamon, and cloves had long been among the most prized commodities in Europe. But until now, they had only reached the continent through complicated and expensive overland trade routes controlled by Muslim and Venetian middlemen. The Portuguese crown now aimed to take direct control of this trade by establishing a permanent presence in the Indian Ocean. The challenge was immense. The Indian Ocean was not an empty space awaiting European entry. It was already a complex and dynamic trade zone connecting East Africa, Arabia, India, Southeast Asia, and China. Ports such as Calicut, Koshan, and Mala bustled with merchants, sailors, and rulers engaged in thriving exchange. Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, and Chinese maritime networks operated independently and efficiently. For Portugal to insert itself into this system, it would need more than ships and navigators. It would need force, strategy, and diplomacy. King Manuel I knew this. After Vasco da Gama's return, the crown quickly sent new expeditions to consolidate the route and assert Portuguese authority. In the year 1500, Pedro Álvares Cabral set out with a larger fleet, aiming to follow Gama's route and secure trade relations in India. Along the way, Cabral's fleet veered far west and made landfall on the coast of what is now Brazil, a discovery that would later become central to Portugal's empire in the Americas, but his main mission was in the east. Reaching Calicut, Cabral attempted to negotiate trade agreements. However, tensions quickly escalated between the Portuguese and the local Muslim merchant community. Violence broke out. Several Portuguese traders were killed, and Cabral retaliated by bombarding the city from the sea. Failing to establish peace in Calicut, he moved on to Cochin, where he found a more favorable political environment and established Portugal's first permanent foothold in India. This initial violence signaled the nature of Portuguese expansion in the Indian Ocean. Unlike earlier maritime powers in the region, Portugal was determined not only to trade, but to dominate. The shift became even more explicit with the arrival of a new and decisive figure, Alonso de Albuquerque. Appointed as the second governor of Portuguese India in the early 16th century, Albuquerque was a military strategist and a bold thinker. He believed that Portugal could not rely on diplomacy alone. Instead, he argued it must seize key ports, control choke points, and construct a naval empire that could enforce a monopoly on the spice trade. His plan was to transform the Portuguese presence in Asia from a series of trading posts into a centralized and armed imperial system, what would later be known as the Estado da India. In the year 1511, Albuquerque led a successful assault on the port city of Goa, then under the control of the Bijapur Sultanate. Strategically located on the western coast of India, Goa had access to inland markets and served as a key node in regional trade. Albuquerque made it the capital of Portuguese India. He expelled local Muslim elites, encouraged the settlement of Portuguese families, and established Christian churches and schools. Goa would remain the center of Portuguese rule in India for over 4 centuries. Following the conquest of Goa, Albuquerque turned his attention to the choke points of the Indian Ocean. In 1511, he seized Malacca, a vital port on the Malay Peninsula that controlled access to the Spice Islands in the South China Sea. The capture of Malaga gave Portugal access to the heart of Southeast Asian trade and a platform for reaching the Moluccas, the legendary Spice Islands of present-day Indonesia. Albuquerque also sought to control the entrance to the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea. In 1512, he attempted to seize the island of Hormuz at the mouth of the Persian Gulf. Though initially unsuccessful, he eventually captured it in 1515, allowing Portugal to monitor and disrupt trade between Persia and India. His final goal, controlling the Red Sea and reaching the Holy Land, remained out of reach. But his strategic vision left a lasting legacy. The Estado da India was not a territorial empire in the modern sense. Portugal did not conquer large inland areas. Instead, it focused on controlling key coastal cities and sea routes. Forts were built in Cochin, Goa, Malacca, and Hormuz. Naval patrols enforced taxes and trade restrictions. Local rulers were sometimes coerced into vassalage, and at other times bribed or negotiated with. Portuguese officials established a system of cartel permits that all ships in the region were required to carry. Without one, a merchant vessel could be seized or sunk. This maritime licensing system helped Portugal dominate Indian Ocean trade, at least for a time. But domination did not mean integration. The Portuguese often found themselves at odds with local customs, religions, and political systems. Their insistence on Christian proselytism, especially under the guidance of Catholic missionaries, sometimes led to resistance. Cultural and linguistic misunderstandings complicated diplomacy. Portuguese attempts to monopolize trade also created new enemies, particularly among Muslim traders and rising regional powers such as the Ottoman Empire. Still, the short-term rewards were immense. Spices, silks, gems, and other luxuries flowed back to Lisbon. The crown grew wealthy and Portugal's position in Europe rose. King Manuel I adopted the grand title, Lord of the Conquest, Navigation, and Commerce of Ethiopia, Arabia, Persia, and India. Lisbon became one of Europe's busiest ports, filled with exotic goods and foreign envoys. The Portuguese Empire was now undeniably global. Yet this rapid expansion also carried risks. Maintaining distant outposts strained the crown's resources. Corruption and mismanagement spread through the ranks of colonial officials. Many Portuguese soldiers and sailors died from disease, poor conditions, or local conflicts. And although Portugal controlled certain ports and trade lanes, it could not govern the vast territories beyond them. Even so, the Estado de India represented a bold and largely successful experiment in the maritime empire. It was the first sustained European effort to control trade in the Indian Ocean by force. It connected Portugal directly to India, Southeast Asia, and the Persian Gulf, and it laid the foundation for further expansion into East Asia. By the early 16th century, Portugal had established itself as the dominant European maritime power in the Indian Ocean. The capture of ports such as Goa, Malaga, and Hormuz had laid the foundations for the Estado de India. Yet, Portuguese ambitions did not stop at the Indian subcontinent or the Malay Peninsula. The next phase of expansion aimed even farther east toward the rich and powerful civilizations of East Asia. Portuguese mariners, merchants, and missionaries were drawn by tales of immense wealth in the east. Silks from China, silver from Japan, and spices from the fabled islands of the South Seas. Much of this knowledge came from Arab traders and Asian intermediaries. Now, with a foothold in Malaya, the Portuguese had a launch point for their eastward advance into uncharted waters. The first major objective was the Moluccas, known in Europe as the Spice Islands. Located in present-day Indonesia, these islands were the source of cloves, nutmeg, and mace, luxuries highly prized in Europe. In the year 1511, even before the full conquest of Malacca, Portuguese expeditions began moving toward the Moluccas. The competition for these islands would later draw in other European powers, but Portugal was the first to arrive. Portuguese ships reached the Bond Islands and Tern by the 1520s. In these remote but economically vital regions, they negotiated directly with local rulers, built small forts, and attempted to monopolize the spice trade. Although Portuguese power was limited by distance and resistance from rival sultanates, they managed to maintain a fragile influence through naval superiority and selective alliances. Meanwhile, attention turned to the vast empire of China. Unlike the trading ports of Southeast Asia, Ming China was a centralized, bureaucratic, and highly regulated empire. Foreign trade was restricted and subject to tribute systems. Nonetheless, Portuguese merchants were determined to open commercial relations. Initial contact did not go smoothly. In the year 1515, Jorge Alvarez became the first known European to set foot on Chinese soil, landing near present-day Hong Kong. Shortly after, a Portuguese fleet led by Simo de Andrade anchored at Tuen Mun. However, their behavior offended Chinese authorities. Reports of violence, smuggling, and even the kidnapping of children sparked tensions. In the year 1522, a Portuguese embassy to the Ming court led by Tom Pers failed disastrously. Several Portuguese envoys were imprisoned or executed. For a time, it seemed that relations with China had been permanently damaged, but over the following decades, more diplomatic and cautious approaches emerged. The turning point came in the year 1557, when the Portuguese were granted the right to settle in a small fishing village called Macau. Situated at the mouth of the Pearl River near Canton, Macau became Portugal's official gateway to China. Macau was unique in the Portuguese Empire. It was not taken by force, but leased through negotiation. The Portuguese paid rent to Chinese authorities and were allowed to build churches, warehouses, and schools. Over time, Macau developed into a mixed community of Portuguese settlers, Chinese residents, and Macanese families of mixed descent. It became a hub for East Asian trade, linking China, Japan, and Southeast Asia to the broader Portuguese network. If China had been cautious, Japan was both curious and open to foreign influence, at least at first. Portuguese traders arrived in Japan in the year 1543, landing near Tanegashima Island. The Japanese were immediately intrigued by Portuguese firearms, known locally as tanagosima, which they began producing domestically. The introduction of European gunpowder weapons had a noticeable impact on the ongoing civil conflicts within Japan known as the Sengoku period. Portuguese merchants brought more than weapons. They introduced new trade goods such as silk from China, wool textiles from Europe, and silver from the Americas. In exchange, they acquired Japanese silver and copper, which they then used in other Asian markets. The resulting triangular trade between Japan, China, and Southeast Asia became highly lucrative. Religion also played a central role in Portuguese-Japanese interactions. In 1549, the Jesuit missionary Francis Xavier arrived in Japan. Backed by the Catholic Church and the Portuguese crown, Xavier preached Christianity in several Japanese domains. He was received with interest and hospitality by local lords, especially in the southern regions of Kyushu. In the following decades, Jesuit missions expanded rapidly. Thousands of Japanese were baptized. Some daimyo, regional warlords, converted and allowed churches to be built in their territories. The Jesuits adapted their methods to local customs, learned the Japanese language, and sometimes dressed in traditional robes to avoid alarming their hosts. However, this period of openness would not last forever. By the end of the 16th century, political unification under leaders such as Toyotomi Hideyoshi and Tokugawa Ieyasu led to greater suspicion of foreign influence. The rise of centralized authority brought new controls over religious activity and trade. Eventually, Christianity would be banned and Portuguese access restricted, but for a brief period, Japan had been an enthusiastic participant in the Portuguese maritime network. In contrast, the Portuguese never gained a permanent foothold in mainland Southeast Asia. Attempts to control areas of modern-day Thailand, Vietnam, and Cambodia met with limited success. While trade contacts and missionary efforts existed, powerful local kingdoms and complex political landscapes made domination impossible. Still, Portuguese cultural and linguistic traces remain in the region, from loanwords in Southeast Asian languages to architectural remnants in coastal cities. Throughout this eastward expansion, the Portuguese relied on flexible strategies. They combined military power, religious missions, and commercial negotiation. They adapted to local customs when necessary, formed alliances when useful, and built forts where possible. But their resources were always limited. The empire was spread thin, and many of its outposts depended on fragile agreements rather than firm control. By the mid-6th century, the Portuguese Empire stretched from Brazil in the west to Japan in the east. It was the first truly global empire in history, maintained by sea power, trade, and a mixture of diplomacy and coercion. But even as it reached its greatest geographic extent, signs of strain were beginning to appear. While the Portuguese Empire expanded across the Indian Ocean and reached the shores of East Asia, another vital chapter unfolded across the South Atlantic. In the Western Hemisphere, the discovery and colonization of Brazil, combined with expanding interests along the African coast, gave rise to a second geographic axis of Portuguese imperial power. This South Atlantic world would become increasingly central to the empire's economic structure, driven by agriculture, mineral wealth, and the transatlantic slave trade. The story of Brazil began with a voyage that was not originally intended to reach the Americas. In the year 1500, Pedro Alvarez Cabral set sail from Lisbon, aiming to follow Vasco da Gama's route to India. However, his fleet veered far to the west, likely due to navigational practices that took advantage of favorable Atlantic winds. On April 22nd, Cabral's ships sighted land, the eastern coast of what is now Brazil. Cabral claimed the territory for the Portuguese crown under the terms of the Treaty of Tortuguesas, signed with Spain in the year 1494. That treaty had divided the non-European world between the two powers with a longitudinal line drawn west of the Cape Verde Islands. Brazil happened to fall within Portugal's assigned zone, giving the Portuguese a legal basis to claim it. Initially, Brazil appeared less promising than India or the Spice Islands. It lacked the established trading systems and concentrated urban centers found in Asia. For the first few decades, Portuguese activity in Brazil remained limited. The primary resource extracted was Brazilwood, a red dye-producing tree that gave the land its name. European merchants traded metal tools, cloth, and other goods with indigenous groups in exchange for logging access. However, as the 16th century progressed, interest in Brazil grew. The potential for plantation agriculture, especially sugarcane, soon became clear. Sugar had already proven profitable on the Atlantic islands of Madras and Stowe, and now Brazil's vast coastline, fertile land, and tropical climate offered even greater possibilities. By the 1530s, the Portuguese crown began to formalize its presence. King John III introduced a system of hereditary captaincies, dividing Brazil into strips of land granted to noblemen or entrepreneurs responsible for colonizing and defending them. The system had mixed results. Many captaincies failed due to poor planning, resistance from indigenous peoples, and lack of resources, but some such as Pernambuco and Sambiche succeeded, especially with the rise of sugar plantations. In 1549, the Portuguese crown established the first centralized colonial government in Brazil, naming Duza as governor-general. He founded the city of Salvador, which became the colonial capital. Forts, churches, and missions followed. With official support, colonization accelerated, and the economic importance of Brazil steadily increased. As sugar production expanded, so did the demand for labor. Initially, the Portuguese attempted to enslave indigenous peoples. Some were captured in raids, while others were coerced through alliances or manipulated into labor through missionary influence. But the scale of resistance, high mortality rates from European diseases, and logistical challenges soon pushed the colonists to seek alternative sources of labor. This brought the African slave trade into the center of the Portuguese Atlantic Empire. For decades, Portugal had maintained trading posts and fortified settlements along the West African coast. These included Elmina in present-day Ghana, Wanda in Angola, and other ports stretching from Senegambia to the Congo River Basin. Some of these posts had originally focused on gold or ivory, but now they became hubs for the export of human beings. The Portuguese did not establish deep territorial control in Africa. Instead, they relied on complex relationships with African rulers and trading networks. Enslaved individuals were often captured during local wars or raids by African groups, then sold to Portuguese agents in exchange for goods such as firearms, textiles, or metal tools. This commerce, while profitable for some African elites, unleashed devastating social consequences, displacement, warfare, and long-term demographic disruption. The Atlantic slave trade became the linchpin connecting Brazil and Africa. By the late 16th century, tens of thousands of enslaved Africans were being shipped across the Atlantic to work in Brazilian plantations, mines, and households. These forced laborers formed the backbone of the colonial economy and would come to shape Brazilian society for centuries to come. Despite the brutality of the system, African cultural influence persisted and spread in Brazil. Language, religion, music, cuisine, and agricultural techniques brought by enslaved Africans blended with Portuguese and indigenous traditions. Over time, Brazil developed the unique cultural landscape that bore the marks of this intense and often violent exchange. Meanwhile, Portuguese interests in Africa were not limited to the slave trade. Missionary activity also expanded, especially among the Kingdom of Congo, where Portuguese priests, teachers, and traders built close ties with local rulers. The King of Congo, Nzenga Ainu, converted to Christianity in the late 15th century and took the name Zong. His successors continued diplomatic and religious exchanges with Portugal, even adopting some European administrative practices. But these alliances were fragile. Cultural misunderstandings, economic exploitation, and competing interests often led to tensions. In some cases, like in Angola, the Portuguese attempted to expand military control beyond their coastal forts, leading to conflicts with African kingdoms such as the Congo. These encounters foreshadowed deeper colonial entanglements in Africa that would intensify in later centuries. Back in Brazil, as plantation agriculture spread, new urban centers emerged along the coast. Cities like Recife, Olinda, and Rio de Janeiro grew into hubs of commerce, administration, and religious life. The Jesuits, who had played an active role in Portuguese missions in Asia, now turned their attention to the Americas. They founded schools and churches, sought to convert indigenous peoples, and sometimes clashed with settlers over the treatment of native communities. By the end of the 16th century, Brazil had surpassed the Asian territories in economic importance to Portugal. Its sugar exports fueled European markets, while African labor supplied the manpower. The South Atlantic had become a vital imperial corridor tying together different continents, cultures, and economies under Portuguese rule. However, this growing prosperity attracted the attention of rivals. Other European powers, especially the Dutch, English, and French, began challenging Portuguese dominance both in the Americas and in Africa. These external pressures would soon test the limits of Portugal's global empire. As Portugal expanded across continents during the 16th and 17th centuries, it carried more than ships, guns, and goods. It carried a worldview shaped by Catholicism. Religion was not merely a private belief system. It was embedded in the fabric of the Portuguese state and served as a powerful tool of imperial governance. The spread of Christianity, particularly Catholicism, became deeply intertwined with Portuguese colonization. Missionaries moved alongside soldiers and merchants, bringing with them not only spiritual teachings, but also European customs, education systems, and cultural assumptions. The roots of this religious drive lay in Portugal's own medieval past. The nation had been born out of the Christian recognition of the Iberian Peninsula. From its earliest days, the Portuguese monarchy maintained close ties with the Church. By the time of overseas expansion, religious motivation was already part of the national narrative. Kings spoke of spreading the faith to new lands as a divine mission, and papal approval reinforced these ambitions. In the early stages of the empire, the Church's role was informal. The chaplain accompanied explorers and settlers to provide religious services. But soon, formal missionary orders became central actors in imperial life. Among them, the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits played the most prominent role. Founded in the year 1534 by Ignatius of Loyola and approved by the Pope in 1540. The Jesuits quickly became the intellectual and missionary arm of the Catholic Counter-Reformation. By the mid-6th century, Jesuits had spread throughout the Portuguese Empire. In India, they established schools and missions in Goa, which had become both the administrative and spiritual capital of Portuguese Asia. The Jesuit College at St. Paul's in Goa became a major center for education and theological training, attracting students from across the region. Jesuit priests learned local languages, translated Christian texts, and sought to engage with Hindu and Muslim communities through dialogue and conversion. One of the most famous missionaries of this period was Francis Xavier, a co-founder of the Society of Jesus. Sent by King John III, Xavier arrived in Goa in the year 1542. He traveled widely across the empire, preaching in India, the Moluccas, and even Japan. Known for his tireless energy and simple message, he baptized thousands and helped lay the groundwork for the Christian communities that would persist in Asia long after his death in 1552. Xavier's mission to Japan marked one of the most remarkable episodes in the history of Portuguese religious expansion. Unlike India, Japan had no prior exposure to Christianity. Yet, within a few decades of Portuguese contact, entire communities had converted and some daimyo even became Christian patrons. Jesuits adapted their teachings to Japanese culture, presenting Christianity in a way that appealed to local elites. Churches were built, schools opened, and Japanese language catechisms printed. This early success, however, also provoked suspicion. Japanese rulers, especially during the unification efforts of the late 16th century, began to view Christianity as a threat to political stability. The presence of foreign missionaries and the loyalty of converts to a distant religious authority raised concerns. By the early 17th century, persecution intensified. Churches were destroyed, missionaries expelled, and Japanese Christians forced underground. The once vibrant Christian community entered a long period of secrecy and survival. In Africa, missionary activity followed a different pattern. In the Kingdom of Congo, the Portuguese crown had supported early conversions, and the Christian faith was adopted by some rulers and elites. The local clergy initially relied on Portuguese priests, but soon African-born clergy emerged, blending Christian teachings with indigenous practices. This produced a unique form of African Christianity shaped by local interpretations and resilience. Jesuits and other missionaries also operated in Angola and Mozambique, often in tandem with Portuguese military or commercial outposts. Their efforts were complicated by the brutal realities of the slave trade. While some missionaries spoke out against the mistreatment of enslaved Africans, others remained silent or justified slavery as a means of converting non-Christians. The Church's role in slavery remains a deeply controversial aspect of its imperial legacy. In Brazil, the religious landscape grew even more complex. Jesuits played a major role in the evangelization of both indigenous populations and African slaves. They established missions called aldas, where they attempted to convert and civilize native peoples by isolating them from colonial society. These aldas were often both spiritual centers and agricultural communities. The Jesuits taught farming, European customs, and Catholic doctrine. In the early stages, the Jesuits sometimes defended indigenous peoples against exploitation by colonists. Figures like Father Manuel de Nora and Father José de Anchieta advocated for better treatment of native Brazilians and opposed their enslavement. However, their approach still aimed at cultural transformation and assimilation into European Christian norms. African slaves in Brazil were also targeted for conversion. Baptism was required at least nominally, and many African-born individuals became part of Catholic brotherhoods known as Mandades. These organizations offered some spiritual and social support, allowing African traditions to blend with Catholic practices. Over time, Afro-Brazilian religions emerged, combining Catholic saints with African deities, a process known as syncretism. Religious festivals, processions, and public rituals became part of daily life in colonial Brazil. Churches were built in every major town, and the clergy wielded significant influence in both spiritual and political matters. However, the church also reinforced social hierarchies. It rarely challenged the racial or economic structures that underpinned colonial society and often benefited from slave labor and land grants. The broader impact of missionary activity across the Portuguese Empire was both transformative and contradictory. Christianity spread widely and became deeply rooted in some communities. Education and literacy improved and new cultural forms emerged through the blending of traditions. But the imposition of religious norms also led to the erosion of indigenous beliefs, suppression of cultural practices, and collaboration with imperial domination. By the 17th century, religion was fully institutionalized within the imperial system. The crown controlled appointments to key ecclesiastical positions under a system known as the padroad, real or royal patronage. This gave the monarchy direct influence over the church in overseas territories. Bishops and priests often served dual roles as spiritual leaders and representatives of royal authority. Tensions between the missionary orders and colonial officials were not uncommon. Jesuits, in particular, sometimes clashed with settlers over the treatment of indigenous labor and the enforcement of Christian morality. In some regions, they acted almost like a parallel government, especially where colonial administration was weak. Despite these tensions, the alliance between the cross and the crown remained central to Portuguese imperial ideology. Missionary work was used to justify conquest and colonization, to discipline colonial populations, and to build cultural cohesion across a sprawling empire. As the 17th century unfolded, however, the Portuguese grip on its empire would be tested not by religious dissent, but by external threats and internal crises. In the next section, we will examine the Iberian Union and the consequences of Portugal's unexpected absorption into the Spanish monarchy. As the 16th century neared its end, the Portuguese Empire was vast, wealthy, and stretched across 4 continents. Yet, beneath the surface of success, it was also vulnerable. The empire depended on long and fragile supply lines, a small population, and increasing competition from other European powers. Internally, political instability would soon expose these weaknesses. The crisis began with the death of King Sebastião in the year 1578. Young and inexperienced, Sebastião had launched a disastrous military expedition to Morocco in an attempt to revive the crusading spirit and expand Portuguese influence in North Africa. The campaign ended in failure at the Battle of Alcácer, Quebec, where the Portuguese army was crushed by Moroccan forces and Sebastião disappeared, likely killed in battle, though nobody was recovered. His death without an heir plunged the kingdom into a succession crisis. The absence of a direct successor led to a short and unstable reign by Sebastião's great-uncle, Cardinal Henrique, who himself died 2 years later in 1580. With no clear heir, multiple claimants emerged. Among them was Antonio Prior of Cato, an illegitimate member of the royal family who was supported by many within Portugal. However, the most powerful claimant was King Philip II of Spain, grandson of King Manuel I of Portugal through his mother. Philip II, already monarch of the vast Spanish Empire, pressed his claim vigorously, backed by a well-organized campaign and the support of many Portuguese nobles who feared civil war. He invaded Portugal in 1580 and defeated Antonio's forces at the Battle of Alcântara. The Cortes of Tomar, Portugal's legislative assembly, recognized Philip as King Philip I of Portugal in 1581 under specific conditions. These conditions were intended to protect Portuguese autonomy. They guaranteed that Portugal would remain a separate kingdom with its own laws, currency, and colonial administration. Portuguese positions in the empire were to be reserved for Portuguese subjects, and Lisbon would continue as the capital. In theory, the 2 crowns were united under a single monarch, but the 2 empires were to remain distinct. This political arrangement is known as the Iberian Union. For 60 years, from 1580 to 1640, the Portuguese and Spanish crowns were held by the same monarch, Philip II, followed by Philip III and Philip IV of Spain. Initially, the arrangement brought
stability. The Portuguese elite were integrated into a wider imperial structure, and the monarchy honored the formal autonomy of Portuguese institutions. However, the reality of the union soon became more complicated. Despite legal separation, Portugal was drawn into the broader geopolitical conflicts of the Spanish Empire. The most damaging consequence came from Spain's long-standing rivalry with the Dutch Republic. In the early 17th century, the Dutch, having declared independence from Spain, launched naval and commercial campaigns to seize overseas territories. Portugal, now tied to Spain, became a target. Dutch forces captured key Portuguese possessions across the globe. They seized parts of Brazil, including Pernambuco and Recife. They challenged Portuguese dominance in West Africa, taking Elmina and El Wanda. In Asia, they expelled the Portuguese from several locations, including Malacca and parts of the Spice Islands. The loss of these territories had devastating effects on Portuguese trade. The Dutch East India Company, formed in the year 1602, quickly replaced the Portuguese as the dominant European power in the Indian Ocean. Portuguese merchants struggled to defend their interests against better-funded and more aggressive Dutch competitors. Meanwhile, within Portugal itself, resentment towards Spanish rule began to grow. Many Portuguese felt that their interests were being subordinated to those of Madrid. Key offices once reserved for Portuguese were increasingly occupied by Spaniards. Economic decline, rising taxes, and military losses deepened dissatisfaction. By the 1630s, the situation had become untenable. Portugal's autonomy was being eroded, and the empire was shrinking. The final straw came during the Catalan revolt in Spain, when the Spanish monarchy demanded greater resources and military support from Portugal. The Portuguese nobility, already disillusioned, began to organize resistance. On December 1, 1640, a group of Portuguese conspirators staged a coup in Lisbon. They arrested the Spanish governor and declared John, Duke of Banza, as King John IV of Portugal. The revolution was swift and largely bloodless in Lisbon, though conflict continued in other parts of the country and empire. The new king belonged to the House of Banza, a noble family with legitimate dynastic claims. His ascension marked the end of the Iberian Union and the beginning of a new Portuguese dynasty. However, independence had to be defended. Spain refused to recognize the Restoration and launched military campaigns to reclaim Portugal. What followed was the Restoration War, a prolonged conflict that lasted until 1668. Portugal received limited international support, notably from France and England, both of whom had reasons to weaken Spain. Despite the odds, Portuguese forces managed to repel several Spanish invasions and maintain control of their territory. The war also extended to the colonies. In Brazil, loyalist forces fought to reclaim areas occupied by the Dutch. In Africa and Asia, Portuguese agents tried to recover lost ground and re-establish trade networks. While not all territories were regained, the Banana Monarchy succeeded in restoring a significant portion of the empire structure. The Iberian Union had a mixed legacy. On one hand, it brought temporary stability and linked Portugal to the largest empire in Europe. On the other, it exposed the fragility of Portuguese autonomy and led to the loss of strategic territories. The period highlighted how global empires could not easily be unified without consequence. For the Portuguese, it served as a painful reminder that their empire, though global, was not invulnerable. Following the restoration of independence, Portugal entered a new phase of imperial rebuilding. In the next section, we will examine how Brazil emerged as the empire's most valuable possession, driven by sugar, gold, and the growing demands of European markets. The restoration of Portuguese independence in the year 1640 marked a turning point in the history of the empire. While the Banza monarchy reasserted national sovereignty after 6 decades of union with Spain, the global empire Portugal had once dominated was now under severe pressure. Throughout the 17th century, 2 rising maritime powers, the Dutch Republic and England, mounted aggressive challenges to Portuguese colonial authority across the Atlantic, Indian, and Pacific Oceans. The Dutch threat had already begun during the Iberian Union, when Portuguese and Spanish interests were merged under the Spanish crown. The Dutch, then in rebellion against Spanish rule during the 80 Years' War, treated Portuguese territories as legitimate targets. Though Portugal and the Netherlands had no original quarrel, the union with Spain entangled Portuguese trade networks in Spain's wider conflicts. In the year 1602, the Dutch founded the Verenigd Oindisch Company, or Dutch East India Company. This powerful chartered company combined private capital with state support and military force. Its goal was not only to profit from Asian trade, but to dominate it. The Dutch quickly recognized that breaking Portuguese control in the Indian Ocean would open lucrative markets for their own merchants. One of the first major Dutch victories came with the seizure of Malha in the year 1611. The strategic port previously conquered by the Portuguese in the early 16th century was critical for accessing the Spice Islands. Its fall dealt a symbolic and practical blow to Portuguese prestige in Southeast Asia. By seizing Malaya, the Dutch secured a direct link to the Moluccas and undercut Portugal's long-standing monopoly on cloves and nutmeg. The Dutch campaigns were not limited to Southeast Asia. In the Persian Gulf, they formed alliances with local rulers hostile to Portuguese control. The Portuguese stronghold of Hormuz, which had been one of the jewels of the Estado de India, was lost in 1622. English forces from the East India Company assisted the Persian Shah in expelling the Portuguese from the island, demonstrating the growing cooperation between anti-Portuguese powers in the African Atlantic. The Dutch West India Company, founded in 1621, launched a parallel assault. Their focus was the Atlantic slave trade and access to gold resources. They captured the important fort of Elmina on the Gold Coast in 1637 and later seized El Wanda in Angola. These victories disrupted Portugal's transatlantic slave supply lines, threatening the viability of Brazil's sugar economy. Brazil itself became a major battleground. In the year 1630, Dutch forces launched an invasion of northeastern Brazil, occupying several key cities, including Rai and Olinda. They declared the Dutch colony of New Holland, which they ruled for over 2 decades. The Dutch West India Company attempted to govern the area by balancing military force with relative tolerance toward local populations. The most famous figure of Dutch Brazil was John Maurice of Nassau, who served as governor from 1637 to 1644. He promoted urban planning, scientific exploration, and religious coexistence. Dutch Brazil became a rare example of a more inclusive colonial experiment with efforts to incorporate Portuguese settlers, African slaves, and indigenous groups into a functioning society. However, Dutch control in Brazil proved difficult to maintain. Resistance from Portuguese settlers loyal to the Banza monarchy gradually intensified. Armed uprisings, guerrilla tactics, and alliances with indigenous groups chipped away at Dutch authority. By 1654, after a series of military defeats, the Dutch surrendered Recife and abandoned their claims in Brazil. This victory was crucial for the Portuguese. Regaining control over Brazil ensured the survival of their most economically vital colony. The sugar plantations fueled by African labor continued to generate wealth for the empire. Still, the effort to expel the Dutch had been costly, and the empire was no longer the global power it once had been. At the same time, English interests were expanding. The English East India Company, chartered in the year 1600, began establishing its own network of trading posts and naval bases throughout Asia. Though not as immediately aggressive as the Dutch, English traders sought to bypass Portuguese and Spanish routes to reach goods directly. They founded outposts in India, gained influence in the Persian Gulf, and eventually established footholds in Southeast Asia. While English attacks on Portuguese colonies were less frequent than Dutch assaults, competition was growing. English ships clashed with Portuguese fleets in the Indian Ocean. Diplomats and traders maneuvered for access to ports and privileges in regions where Portugal had once been the sole European presence. The new maritime order was multipolar and increasingly competitive. Beyond military and economic losses, the Portuguese faced another challenge: the limits of imperial administration. The 17th century was a period of overstretched governance. The crown in Lisbon struggled to send reinforcements, maintain fortifications, or pay salaries to officials spread across far-flung territories. Corruption, mismanagement, and local rebellions compounded the difficulties. Some regions drifted toward autonomy. In parts of Asia, Portuguese settlers and mixed-race populations formed their own communities with limited oversight from Lisbon. These communities continued to trade, intermarry, and worship in ways that reflected the hybrid nature of the empire. While Lisbon lost effective control, Portuguese language, customs, and religion often persisted. One key example was Macau. Despite growing pressure from both Chinese authorities and rival European traders, the city remained under Portuguese administration. It survived partly because the Portuguese adapted to local expectations, paid tribute, and avoided the provocative behavior that had doomed earlier efforts to engage China. In Japan, however, the situation worsened. By the 1630s, the Tokugawa shogunate had begun a full crackdown on Christianity and foreign influence. Portuguese missionaries and traders were expelled, Japanese Christians persecuted, and the nation entered a period of isolation. The Portuguese were replaced by the Dutch, who were allowed to trade under strict conditions from the artificial island of Dejima in Nagasaki. This marked the end of Portuguese influence in Japan. In the Americas, Portuguese Brazil increasingly operated as the central pillar of the empire. The loss of Asian ports shifted more attention toward the South Atlantic. The transatlantic slave trade, sugar exports, and inland expansion became focal points for recovery. The Crown encouraged settlement, supported religious missions, and established tighter administrative structures. By the end of the 17th century, the Portuguese Empire had changed dramatically. It was no longer the unrivaled maritime power of the early 16th century. It had lost many of its Asian and African strongholds, suffered humiliation at the hands of the Dutch, and struggled to compete with the growing power of England and France. Yet it had also survived. The recapture of Brazil, continued control of Angola and Mozambique, and the persistence of cultural and religious influence across its former territories allowed Portugal to retain a global presence. The empire adapted, reconfigured, and looked increasingly toward the Atlantic world for its future. By the middle of the 17th century, Portugal had reasserted its independence under the Inganza dynasty, but that independence was far from secure. The declaration of sovereignty in the year 1640, led by John, Duke of Banza, now crowned King John IV, sparked a prolonged and dangerous struggle known as the Restoration War. This war would not only determine Portugal's future as a sovereign state, but would also shape the course of its global empire during a time of transition and recovery. The Restoration War lasted nearly 3 decades from 1640 to 1668. Although the decisive action had taken place in Lisbon with the bloodless coup against Spanish rule, the real challenge was holding the newly restored kingdom against the might of the Spanish Habsburg monarchy. Spain under King Philip IV refused to recognize Joel's claim to the throne and was determined to reassert control over Portugal and its overseas possessions. Despite the looming threat, the Portuguese people rallied behind their new monarch. The Banza claim was supported not only by traditional aristocrats, but also by merchants, clergy, and common citizens who had grown resentful of Spanish dominance. Jerome IV acted swiftly. He created a council of war, reformed the army, and sought foreign alliances. Recognizing that Portugal could not win the war alone, he looked abroad for support. The international context proved favorable. Spain was already embroiled in multiple conflicts across Europe, including the 30 Years' War, which drained its resources and divided its attention. France, a major rival of Spain, provided diplomatic and financial support to Portugal. England, though initially cautious, would later enter into a formal alliance with Portugal through the marriage of Catherine of Banza to King Charles II in the year 1662. That alliance gave Portugal a powerful political ally at a critical moment. The war itself consisted of periodic skirmishes and large-scale battles along the Iberian frontier. Portuguese forces, often outnumbered, relied on strategic defense, local knowledge, and guerrilla tactics to hold back Spanish incursions. One of the most significant victories came at the Battle of Montes Claros in the year 1665, where Portuguese troops decisively defeated a larger Spanish army. The victory helped solidify Portuguese morale and persuaded foreign powers that the Banza regime was here to stay. While fighting continued in Europe, the Banza government also moved to reassert control over the overseas empire. This involved both diplomatic recognition and direct military action. In Brazil, the Portuguese had already regained territory from the Dutch, but internal consolidation was still needed. Colonial administrators strengthened defenses, improved port facilities, and encouraged immigration to expand the settler population. Brazil, with its vast land and profitable sugar plantations, was now clearly seen as the cornerstone of the imperial economy. Elsewhere, the recovery was more uneven. Some territories lost during the Iberian Union were never regained. The Dutch retained control over parts of the Spice Islands and had disrupted Portuguese trade networks throughout Asia. In Africa, several forts had fallen, and the Portuguese struggled to recover former influence. Still, the empire held together, and Portuguese sovereignty was gradually reasserted in key regions like Angola, Mozambique, and Macau. One of the central challenges facing the banana monarchy was administrative reform. The 17th century revealed just how fragile and overstretched Portugal's global system had become. Communication between Lisbon and distant colonies could take many months. Corruption among colonial officials, inconsistent tax collection, and inefficient governance weakened imperial cohesion. In response, the crown took steps to centralize authority and improve accountability. Viceroy and governors were given clearer mandates, and oversight councils were established to monitor their performance. The Casada India, which had once managed all overseas trade and administration, was restructured to better coordinate naval defense, economic policy, and colonial law. Lisbon also expanded the use of royal charters and monopolies to stabilize income and control smuggling. Religious institutions continued to play a major role in imperial life. The Jesuits remained influential in education, conversion efforts, and mediation between settlers and indigenous populations. However, their power was increasingly scrutinized by the crown. The state sought to balance religious influence with royal authority, ensuring that missionary work supported rather than challenged political goals. Meanwhile, cultural and intellectual life in Portugal began to reflect a renewed sense of national pride. Literature, art, and religious devotions celebrated the Banza dynasty and the resilience of the Portuguese people. Writers chronicled the heroism of soldiers and saints, while artists depicted the grandeur of the restored monarchy. The restoration of independence was framed not only as a political event, but as a divine triumph and a moral vindication of Portugal's unique identity. In the year 1668, after nearly 3 decades of intermittent conflict, the Treaty of Lisbon was signed between Portugal and Spain. The treaty formally recognized João Ive's descendants as the legitimate rulers of Portugal and ended the Restoration War. Although Spain retained some grievances, it could no longer sustain military pressure on Portugal without risking other losses in Europe. With the treaty signed and independence secured, Portugal could finally focus on rebuilding and redefining its empire. The end of the Restoration War marked a new chapter, one of recovery, reform, and recalibration. The world had changed. The Dutch and English now challenged Portuguese trade on every front. France was beginning to expand its own colonial ambitions. Portugal would have to adapt to survive in this shifting landscape. Still, the survival of the empire was no small achievement. Despite military defeats, diplomatic setbacks, and economic challenges, Portugal had managed to restore its sovereignty and hold on to key parts of its global network. Brazil remained in Portuguese hands. The African slave trade continued to fuel plantation economies, and pockets of influence in Asia still endured. Following the conclusion of the Restoration War and the formal recognition of Portuguese independence in the late 17th century, Portugal entered a new imperial phase. No longer the unrivaled maritime empire of the earlier Age of Discovery, the kingdom turned its attention inward toward its largest and most valuable colony, Brazil. Over the next century, Brazil would transform from a peripheral plantation society into the economic, demographic, and administrative center of the Portuguese Empire. At the heart of this transformation were 2 powerful forces, sugar and gold. Sugar production had already been the mainstay of the Brazilian economy since the 16th century. The plantation system, developed first in the Atlantic Islands and later expanded in northeastern Brazil, relied heavily on African slave labor. By the late 17th century, regions such as Pernambuco and Bahia were deeply entrenched in the global sugar trade. However, the profitability of sugar had begun to decline. Competition from other colonial producers, especially in the Caribbean, put pressure on prices. Dutch and French colonies, in particular, were producing high volumes of sugar with increasingly efficient systems. Portuguese Brazil needed a new economic engine to sustain its colonial enterprise. That new engine arrived quite literally from beneath the surface. In the late 1680s and early 1690s, explorers known as bandeirantes began pushing deep into Brazil's interior, beyond the officially designated boundaries of Portuguese control. These groups, often composed of mixed-race adventurers and frontiersmen, were originally motivated by the capture of indigenous slaves, but their focus soon shifted when gold was discovered in the mountainous region known as Minas Gerais, literally general mines. The gold rush that followed radically altered the colonial structure. By the early 18th century, Minas Gerais had become the most economically dynamic part of the colony. Thousands of migrants, both from Portugal and from coastal Brazil, made their way to the interior in search of fortune. Entire towns sprang up almost overnight, including Vieira, modern-day Euroto, which became the epicenter of gold production. The influx of people and capital brought dramatic changes. Roads were constructed to link the mining regions to the ports of Rio de Janeiro and Salvador. New settlements emerged along these routes, stimulating trade, agriculture, and services. The Crown, keen to control the wealth pouring from the ground, imposed strict regulations. All gold had to be processed in government smelters, where it was taxed at a standard rate known as the quinto, a royal fifth. Tax evasion was rampant, prompting the establishment of a network of inspectors and troops to enforce compliance. In some regions, gold was hidden in barrels disguised as food or melted into common objects. The Crown responded with brutal crackdowns, including confiscations and arrests. Still, the wealth generated was extraordinary. During the peak decades of the early 18th century, Brazil produced more gold than any other region in the world, and Lisbon's economy became dependent on the flow of this resource. The social consequences of the gold boom were equally profound. The mining towns were rough, diverse, and often lawless. They drew people from across the empire: Portuguese settlers, African slaves, free people of color, indigenous guides, merchants, and craftsmen. Social hierarchies were in flux, while white landowners and crown officials held power. Wealthy freedmen and mixed-race entrepreneurs sometimes rose to positions of local influence. The demand for labor exploded. Enslaved Africans were forcibly brought to the mining regions in large numbers, facing brutal conditions underground and in the surrounding settlements. While some gained many missions through saving or patronage, the vast majority lived under harsh and dehumanizing conditions. Slave rebellions and escapes occurred in Colombos, runaway slave communities developed in the hinterlands, forming parallel societies outside colonial control. The largest and most famous of these was Pomares, located in what is now the state of Alagoas. Though it had existed since the previous century, Pomares grew significantly during the height of the gold rush. It was eventually destroyed by Portuguese forces in the late 17th century, but its legacy continued as a symbol of resistance and autonomy for Afro-Brazilian communities. Administratively, the crown took steps to consolidate its control over Brazil. In the year 1716, the capital was officially moved from Salvador to Rio de Janeiro, reflecting the shift in economic gravity toward the southeastern region. Rio became the gateway for gold exports, the administrative center of the southern captaincies, and the key point of contact between Lisbon and the interior. Portugal also tightened its colonial bureaucracy. A more professional class of administrators, tax collectors, and military officers was sent from Europe. The invaders, royal judges, and captains Moors, military commanders, were tasked with enforcing crown policy and quelling unrest. At the same time, the church maintained a powerful presence. Jesuits continued to operate missions, while the diocese and clergy provided spiritual oversight and education. Education in colonial Brazil was largely religious in nature. Jesuit colleges in major towns taught Latin, rhetoric, and Christian doctrine, primarily to the sons of elite families. Access to higher education remained limited, and most colonial Brazilians, especially women, indigenous people, and enslaved Africans, had little opportunity for formal schooling. Despite these limits, cultural life flourished. The wealth from mining funded churches, music, and architecture. Baroque art and religious festivals became central features of colonial towns. In cities like Ouro and Marana, ornate churches were constructed using local materials and craftsmanship, often blending European styles with African and indigenous elements. The sculptor Alé had been active in the late 18th century and became a symbol of this hybrid artistic tradition. The intellectual climate also evolved. While censorship and religious orthodoxy remained strong, Enlightenment ideas began to filter into Brazil through books, correspondence, and returning students. Some members of the colonial elite started to question the rigid structures of monarchy, slavery, and overseas governance. These seeds of critique would eventually bear fruit in later periods of unrest. Portugal's reliance on Brazilian gold was both a blessing and a burden. It allowed the crown to pay off debts, fund European wars, and finance public works. Lisbon was rebuilt after the devastating earthquake of the year 1755, using wealth extracted from the mines of Minas Gerais. But this dependence also made the empire vulnerable. As gold production declined in the later 18th century due to exhaustion of easy-to-access deposits and falling returns, Portugal faced renewed fiscal strain. Moreover, the centralization of the Brazilian economy created resentment among regional elites. Conflicts over tax policy, trade restrictions, and political appointments grew sharper. The colonial relationship was increasingly seen as extractive with little return to the local population. The stage was being set for new forms of resistance. By the mid-18th century, Brazil had become more than just a colony. It was the lifeblood of the Portuguese Empire. Its economy, population, and cultural development had outpaced those of Portugal's Asian holdings, and it played a dominant role in shaping imperial policy. Lisbon's fortunes rose and fell with the state of Brazil's interior. By the middle of the 18th century, the Portuguese Empire faced both opportunity and crisis. Brazil had become its economic centerpiece, enriched by gold and sugar. Yet the empire remained burdened by inefficiencies, corruption, and outdated institutions. It was in this context that Sebastião José de Carvalho Melo, better known as the Maris of Pombal, emerged as the most powerful and transformative figure in Portuguese politics during the Enlightenment era. Born into a minor noble family in the early 18th century, Carvalho Alu rose through the ranks of diplomacy and administration through a combination of intelligence, pragmatism, and political cunning. His career accelerated when King José I ascended to the throne in the year 1750, elevating Carvalho to positions of increasing authority. Within a few years, he became de facto prime minister, wielding power with unmatched influence over both domestic and colonial affairs. The defining moment that propelled PAL into full control was the devastating Lisbon earthquake of 1755. On the morning of All Saints' Day, a massive tremor struck the capital, followed by a tsunami and widespread fires. Tens of thousands died and much of the city was reduced to rubble. Churches collapsed during Mass and the royal palace was destroyed. In the face of catastrophe, King José retreated from public life and Pal stepped forward to lead the recovery. His response to the disaster was swift and resolute. "Bury the dead and feed the living," he reportedly declared. He mobilized resources, imposed martial order, and commissioned engineers and architects to rebuild Lisbon on a modern, rational grid plan. The reconstructed capital featured broad boulevards, earthquake-resistant buildings, and centralized administrative facilities reflecting Enlightenment ideals of order, symmetry, and functionality. Pal's ambitions extended far beyond urban reconstruction. He saw the Lisbon earthquake not only as a tragedy, but as a symbolic rupture from the past. He used the crisis as justification to overhaul the monarchy, the economy, the educational system, and the colonial apparatus. In doing so, he launched a sweeping program of reform aimed at strengthening royal power, reducing the influence of the nobility and the church, and modernizing the empire. One of his most controversial moves was the expulsion of the Jesuits from Portuguese territories in the year 1759. Though the Jesuits had played a central role in education and missionary work across the empire, Pommel viewed them as a threat to secular authority, accusing them of political intrigue, economic exploitation, and resistance to reform. He ordered their expulsion from Portugal and its colonies, confiscated their property, and closed their schools. In Brazil, this decision had significant consequences. Jesuit missions among indigenous peoples were dismantled, and their lands were transferred to crown control or secular authorities. While some missionaries had protected native communities from enslavement, their removal opened the door to increased exploitation by settlers and colonial officials. At the same time, Pombal imposed tighter control over Brazilian administration. He restructured the captaincies, increased tax collection, and attempted to curb smuggling and corruption. Education reform was another key priority. Pal sought to break the church's monopoly on knowledge by establishing secular schools and promoting practical sciences. He founded new institutions, introduced standardized curricula, and encouraged the translation of foreign texts. The goal was to produce a class of educated bureaucrats, engineers, and administrators loyal to the crown and capable of managing the complexities of an empire. Economically, Pombal aimed to diversify and rationalize Portugal's trade. He created royal companies to regulate exports and imports, attempted to stimulate manufacturing, and sought to reduce dependence on foreign merchants. In Brazil, he encouraged new industries such as cotton, tobacco, and cattle ranching. He also tightened control over gold production, reinforcing regulations and expanding the role of state inspectors. Yet Pal's reforms were not without resistance. The old aristocracy, accustomed to privilege and autonomy, bristled at his centralizing policies. The clergy opposed his secularization efforts, and many colonial officials resented his aggressive oversight. Pal ruled with an authoritarian hand, using censorship, exile, and even torture to silence dissent. His network of informants and police created a climate of fear, particularly after the so-called Tavora affair. In 1758, King José survived an attempted assassination. Pal used the incident to eliminate powerful noble families, most notably the Tavora family, accusing them of treason and conspiracy. Several were executed publicly, and their estates were confiscated. The affair solidified Pommel's dominance, but revealed the ruthlessness behind his reforms. Despite his heavy-handed methods, Pal left a lasting legacy. His policies modernized the Portuguese state, expanded crown authority, and brought Enlightenment principles into the heart of imperial governance. Lisbon became a symbol of resilience and rationality. Rebuilt from ruins into a European capital that embodied Enlightenment aesthetics and central planning. In Brazil, the effects were equally far-reaching. The colony became more integrated into the imperial system with new institutions, regulations, and infrastructure. The gold economy, while beginning to decline, was managed with greater efficiency. New economic sectors and frontier regions were opened. However, the removal of the Jesuits and the expansion of royal authority also led to greater tensions with local elites and indigenous communities. One of Pal's more ambitious colonial experiments was the elevation of the Amazon region. He promoted the colonization of the northern interior, encouraging settlement and trade along the Amazon River. New administrative divisions were created, and settlers were offered incentives to migrate. The goal was to assert Portuguese sovereignty over contested territories and to counter Spanish expansion from the west. However, the remoteness of the region and the difficulty of transport limited the full success of these plans. Pal's era came to an end with the death of King Jose in 1777. His successor, Queen Maria I, distrusted Pal and dismissed him shortly after taking the throne. Some of his policies were reversed or softened, but the institutional changes he introduced endured. His reforms had strengthened the Portuguese state and redefined its empire in an age of enlightenment and economic transformation. Yet these same reforms also planted seeds of discontent. The centralization of power, the expansion of taxation, and the curtailment of traditional privileges generated resentment among colonists, merchants, and nobles. In Brazil, regional identities hardened, and calls for greater autonomy began to emerge, especially as Enlightenment ideas about liberty and governance circulated more widely. The Maris of Pal remains a complex figure in Portuguese history, praised as a modernizer and vilified as a despot, but there is no denying his influence. He reshaped the Portuguese Empire at a moment of crisis, bringing it into alignment with new political and intellectual currents. His legacy would echo in the decades to come, especially as revolutions began to shake the foundations of empires across the Atlantic world. As the 18th century came to a close, Portugal once again found itself caught in the path of powerful European forces beyond its control. The Napoleonic Wars, which engulfed much of the continent, shook the foundations of European monarchies and empires alike. For Portugal, these events triggered one of the most extraordinary moments in its imperial history, the relocation of the royal court to Brazil. In an era when European powers clung tightly to their colonies, Portugal made the unprecedented decision to move its seat of government across the Atlantic, temporarily transforming Brazil from a colony into the center of the empire. The initial crisis arose from Portugal's long-standing alliance with Britain. Since the late 14th century, the Anglo-Portuguese alliance has endured as one of the oldest diplomatic relationships in the world. But by the early 19th century, that alliance placed Portugal in direct opposition to Napoleon Bonaparte's ambitions. As Emperor of France, Napoleon sought to dominate continental Europe and strangle British commerce through his continental system, a blockade intended to prevent British goods from entering European markets. Portugal, economically dependent on British trade, refused to comply with the blockade. Its ports remained open to British ships, prompting Napoleon to act. In the year 187, he reached an agreement with Spain to invade and divide Portugal. French troops under General Junot marched toward Lisbon, while Spanish forces prepared to occupy the southern provinces. Faced with imminent occupation, and without the military strength to resist, the Portuguese royal family made a dramatic decision. With the support of the British Navy, they fled Lisbon in November of that year, embarking on a fleet of dozens of ships accompanied by thousands of courtiers, officials, soldiers, and servants. This exodus was not simply a retreat, it was a royal transplantation of the entire government. After a harrowing Atlantic crossing, the fleet arrived in Salvador Bahia and then continued on to Rio de Janeiro. In March of 1808, Prince Regent John, later King John VI, formally established the Portuguese court in Brazil. For the first time in colonial history, a European monarchy was ruling from the American continent. The consequences of this relocation were immense. Politically, it shifted the axis of the Portuguese Empire. Brazil, once the periphery, now became the imperial capital. Royal institutions were recreated on Brazilian soil. The palace, ministries, treasury, and foreign embassies were all re-established in Rio. The presence of the court conferred prestige and attracted new elites to the city. Government functions from customs to diplomacy now operated from across the Atlantic. Economically, the change brought major liberalization. In 188, Prince Jonah issued a decree opening Brazilian ports to foreign trade, ending centuries of colonial restriction under the exclusive Portuguese trade system. British merchants flooded the Brazilian market, establishing a strong commercial presence and accelerating integration into global capitalism. The move also stimulated infrastructure development. New roads, docks, banks, and printing presses appeared to meet the needs of the expanded administration. Culturally and socially, the transformation of Rio de Janeiro was dramatic. The city, which had previously been a colonial port with modest public buildings, became a royal capital bustling with aristocrats, soldiers, scholars, and foreign diplomats. The arrival of the royal family triggered waves of construction, including the creation of libraries, opera houses, botanical gardens, and mines. In 1810, the Royal Library opened to the public, followed by the establishment of a medical school and other institutions of higher learning. Yet, these developments also highlighted contradictions within colonial society. Slavery remained central to the Brazilian economy. While the court introduced European customs and Enlightenment ideals, enslaved Africans and their descendants made up a significant portion of the urban population, and performed much of the labor that supported royal life. The opulence of the court stood in stark contrast to the poverty and inequality that defined Brazilian society. For the European territories of the Portuguese Empire, the royal relocation had mixed effects. With the monarchy physically absent, Portuguese resistance to the French occupation fell largely to local forces and British allies. In 188, British troops under the command of Sir Arthur Wellesley, later the Duke of Wellington, landed in Portugal and began pushing French forces out. The Peninsula War, as it became known, lasted several years and devastated parts of the Iberian Peninsula, but ultimately led to the expulsion of the French. By 1813, Portuguese and British forces had retaken most of the territory, and the Portuguese government in exile retained its legitimacy. However, the experience of foreign occupation and the absence of the monarchy created new political tensions. Constitutionalists and reformers in Lisbon began calling for a written constitution and limits on royal power. These ideas echoed the broader wave of liberalism sweeping across Europe following the French Revolution and the Napoleonic era. Meanwhile, in Brazil, the prolonged presence of the court raised new expectations. Brazilian elites, especially those in the southeastern provinces, benefited from the new openness to trade and the attention of the monarchy. They began to see themselves not merely as colonials, but as subjects of a shared empire. Many believed that Brazil should enjoy equal status with Portugal, if not full autonomy. In 1815, in response to growing pressure, Prince João elevated Brazil to the rank of a co-equal kingdom within the newly declared United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves. This change formally ended Brazil's status as a colony and acknowledged its central role in the empire. However, it also raised the question, if Brazil was no longer a colony, should it not govern itself more directly? That question became more urgent when King João VI finally returned to Portugal in 1821. Pressured by liberal revolutionaries in Lisbon and faced with unrest in Europe, he left his son Dom Pedro as regent in Brazil. The return of the monarch to Portugal was meant to restore order and reassert traditional authority, but instead it triggered a chain of events that would lead to Brazil's independence. The relocation of the court to Brazil had reshaped the empire in ways no one had fully foreseen. It had brought unprecedented development, institutional growth, and political sophistication to the colony. It had introduced liberal economic policies and exposed Brazilians to European political debates. Most importantly, it showed that governance could take place outside the metropole. When the king left, he did not take the empire with him. Brazil remained strong, organized, and increasingly self-aware. When King João VI returned to Portugal in the year 1821, he left behind more than an administrative structure in Brazil. He left behind a transformed society. During the 13 years of royal residence, Brazil had evolved from a dependent colony into a kingdom with its own political institutions, elite networks, and sense of identity. Now with the monarch back in Lisbon and his son Dom Pedro acting as regent, the balance between Portugal and Brazil entered a period of tension that would ultimately lead to rupture. The immediate cause of this tension lay in conflicting political visions in Portugal. The Liberal Revolution of 1820 had established a constitutional framework aimed at limiting royal power and centralizing the empire under the Cortes in Lisbon. The new constitution, driven by Portuguese liberals and military officers, called for the return of the king and the subordination of Brazil to Portugal's National Assembly. This move directly contradicted the elevated status that Brazil had achieved as a co-equal kingdom in 1815. From the perspective of Brazilian elites, landowners, merchants, and professionals, the reforms proposed by the Portuguese Cortes threatened their autonomy and the gains made during the royal court's residence in Rio de Janeiro. The reimposition of colonial status was not only a legal change, it implied a loss of power, economic freedom, and symbolic recognition. Many feared a return to the restrictive mercantile system and subservience to Lisbon's dictates. Dom Pedro, the Prince Regent in Brazil, found himself at the center of this constitutional struggle. Pressured by the Cortes to return to Portugal and dissolve the Brazilian regency, he was also lobbied by Brazilian factions urging him to resist. After months of deliberation and public demonstrations in his favor, Dom Pedro made a historic choice. On January 9, 1822, he announced his decision to remain in Brazil, a moment known as the Dia de Fico, or I Will Stay Day. This act of defiance marked a point of no return. Over the following months, Dom Pedro dismissed Portuguese officials loyal to the Cortes, convened a constituent assembly in Brazil, and reorganized the military under local leadership. As tensions escalated, both sides prepared for confrontation. Cortes continued to demand submission, while Brazilian leaders increasingly pushed for full independence. On September 7, 1822, while traveling in the Espalo province, Dom Pedro received new orders from Lisbon that reinforced Portugal's intention to reassert control. In response, he reportedly drew his sword and declared, "Independencia ou morte, independence or death." That same day, he formally proclaimed Brazil's independence from Portugal. In December of that year, Dom Pedro was crowned Emperor Pedro I of Brazil, founding a constitutional monarchy distinct from the Portuguese crown. The new empire retained much of the political structure inherited from the earlier royal court, including a centralized administration, an imperial army, and strong executive power. However, it now operated under a Brazilian flag, with loyalty directed toward Rio de Janeiro rather than Lisbon. The Declaration of Independence was not universally embraced. In several provinces, especially in the north and northeast, Portuguese loyalist forces resisted the new imperial authority. Armed conflicts broke out in Bahia, Maranhão, Para, and other regions requiring military intervention by pro-independence forces. The War for Independence lasted until late 1823, with varying degrees of violence and negotiation. Eventually, most Portuguese troops surrendered or were expelled. Portugal itself was in no position to wage a full-scale colonial war. The kingdom was still recovering from political instability and had limited resources to project power across the Atlantic. In 1825, under pressure from Britain, Portugal formally recognized Brazil's independence in exchange for a financial settlement and diplomatic concessions. It marked the end of more than 3 centuries of Portuguese rule in South America. The loss of Brazil dealt a severe blow to the Portuguese Empire. Brazil had been its largest, richest, and most populous colony. The empire's Atlantic structure, built on sugar, gold, and the transatlantic slave trade, was now fractured. Without Brazil, Portugal's remaining colonies in Africa and Asia assumed greater importance, but none could match Brazil's strategic or economic significance. Politically, the independence of Brazil exposed the limits of metropolitan control over overseas territories during an age of constitutional change and national awakening. Liberalism, Enlightenment thought, and the example of other independence movements across the Americas had combined to undermine the legitimacy of colonial rule. Even within monarchies, the principle of representative government and national self-determination was gaining ground. For Brazil, independence did not bring an immediate transformation of society. Slavery continued and political power remained concentrated among landowning elites. However, the rupture with Portugal allowed for the emergence of a distinct national identity built around the imperial court, a Portuguese-speaking majority, and shared territorial ambitions. Brazil would become one of the few post-colonial states in the Americas to remain a monarchy, at least for the rest of the 19th century. In Portugal, the loss of Brazil prompted a reassessment of imperial priorities. The monarchy, weakened by political division and economic hardship, turned its attention toward its African colonies, particularly Angola and Mozambique. These territories, once considered peripheral, would become central to a second wave of Portuguese imperialism in the decades to come. At the same time, the cultural and personal ties between Portugal and Brazil remained strong. Portuguese immigrants continued to settle in Brazil. Trade relations endured, and members of the royal family maintained influence on both sides of the Atlantic. The imperial breakup was political, but not a complete severance of social and economic bonds. The collapse of Portugal's first global empire was not a sudden fall, but a turning point. The transition from colonial domination to independent nationhood in Brazil represented the end of an era defined by maritime expansion, royal absolutism, and mercantile economics. What followed would be a new phase in Portuguese imperial history, one focused less on oceanic navigation and more on continental consolidation. With the loss of Brazil in the early 19th century, Portugal's first global empire had effectively come to an end. The wealth, population, and strategic influence of its South American possession had far surpassed all other colonial holdings, but Portugal was not ready to surrender its imperial ambitions. As the 19th century progressed, Lisbon began to look elsewhere for imperial revival and found its answer in Africa. For centuries, Portugal had maintained a patchwork presence along the African coast, especially in Angola and Mozambique. These territories had been involved primarily in the Atlantic slave trade and small-scale commerce. Yet they were never fully colonized in the European sense of the word. Portuguese control remained coastal and limited in reach. The interiors were largely autonomous, ruled by African kingdoms, local leaders, or mixed populations beyond Lisbon's effective authority. That would begin to change during the last quarter of the 19th century, when a new phase of European imperialism known as the Scramble for Africa transformed the political geography of the continent. Driven by industrialization, competition among European powers, and a belief in the civilizing mission, countries such as Britain, France, Germany, and Belgium rapidly sought to acquire and formalize territorial claims across Africa. Portugal, though no longer a great power, feared being left behind. The monarchy and ruling elite were determined to retain international relevance and assert a legacy of discovery and expansion that dated back to the 15th century. With limited military and financial capacity, Portugal embarked on a campaign of diplomatic lobbying, exploratory missions, and administrative formalization aimed at securing large contiguous territories in Africa. One of the central ambitions of Portuguese policy during this period was to connect its two main African colonies, Angola in the west and Mozambique in the east, across the interior of the continent. This vision, often referred to as the rose-colored Mapacorde Road, envisioned a horizontal swath of Portuguese-controlled land stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the Indian Ocean. Lisbon argued that centuries of presence along the coasts gave it historic rights to the hinterlands. However, this ambition collided with British plans for a north-to-south railway connecting Cairo in Egypt to Cape Town in South Africa. The British route would pass directly through the Central African territories claimed by Portugal. Tensions reached a peak in the year 1890 when Britain issued an ultimatum demanding Portugal's withdrawal from contested areas in present-day Malawi and Zambia. The Portuguese government, under pressure and lacking international support, was forced to concede. The diplomatic humiliation sparked widespread outrage in Portugal and contributed to domestic instability. Nationalists accused the monarchy of weakness, and Republican sentiment gained momentum. Though the dream of a trans-African Portuguese empire was abandoned, the episode demonstrated how Portugal's colonial aspirations had become central to its national identity, even as its resources remained limited. Following the British ultimatum, Portugal moved to consolidate what territory it still held. This marked the beginning of a more systematic effort to establish colonial rule in Angola and Mozambique. Earlier trade posts and missionary stations were transformed into administrative centers. The Portuguese began building roads, telegraph lines, and railways, though always at a much slower pace than other colonial powers. A growing number of European settlers, though never large in number, arrived to pursue agriculture and commercial opportunities. The formalization of rule also meant greater involvement in military campaigns. Many regions resisted Portuguese expansion, especially in the interiors where African politics had long maintained their independence. In Angola, resistance came from groups such as the Oimbandu and the Congo. In Mozambique, the Gaza Empire under Gungunhana mounted strong opposition. Portugal responded with brutal force, using European officers, African conscripts, and alliances with rival local leaders to subdue resistance. By the early 20th century, Portugal had succeeded in extending nominal control over much of Angola and Mozambique, though real power remained uneven. Large parts of both colonies were administered through indirect rule or economic concessions granted to private companies. These companies, such as the Companhia de Moçambique and the Companhia do Niassa, were granted wide-ranging powers including tax collection, land expropriation, and forced labor. In return, they were expected to develop infrastructure and produce profits for the empire. The human cost of this arrangement was immense. African populations were subjected to harsh labor regimes, low wages, and limited access to education or legal recourse. Forced labor, known as chibolo, became a widespread practice. Many men were compelled to work on plantations, in mines, or on railway construction under threat of violence or imprisonment. Women and children bore the brunt of disrupted communities, food shortages, and social dislocation. Portugal defended its colonial practices with the rhetoric of civilization and progress. Lisbon presented itself as a benevolent power, bringing Christianity, Portuguese language, and modernity to Africa. Missionary activity expanded and schools were established, though only a small fraction of Africans received formal education. In reality, the colonial system prioritized resource extraction and racial hierarchy over development or rights. The imperial revival in Africa also affected Portugal itself. The monarchy used colonial successes to bolster its domestic legitimacy, presenting the empire as a source of national pride and identity. School textbooks, public monuments, and international exhibitions celebrated Portuguese explorers, missionaries, and administrators. Yet this reliance on colonial glory could not mask the deepening political and economic crises at home. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were marked by rising republicanism, labor unrest, and declining royal authority. The monarchy, already weakened by repeated scandals and perceived failures, could not withstand growing public dissatisfaction. In the year 1910, the Portuguese monarchy was overthrown in a peaceful revolution, and the First Republic was proclaimed. The new republican regime inherited the colonial empire and remained committed to its expansion. Colonial governors were reshuffled, legal reforms were introduced, and symbolic ties to the monarchy were removed. However, the underlying structure of exploitation, racial inequality, and economic dependency remained unchanged. The republic's limited resources and ongoing instability meant that colonial policy continued to be reactive, underfunded, and uneven. Despite these challenges, Portugal maintained its African colonies, while most other European powers moved toward gradual reform or eventual decolonization. By the early 20th century, Angola and Mozambique had become the core of what historians call Portugal's Second Empire, an empire based not on maritime exploration, but on territorial occupation and direct rule. In addition to Angola and Mozambique, Portugal also retained smaller colonies in Africa including Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde and Stay and Principe. Though less prominent, these territories played roles in trade, labor supply, and naval strategy. In Asia, only tiny enclaves remained, such as Macau in China and Portuguese Timor in Southeast Asia. These were reminders of a once global empire now largely concentrated in Africa. Portugal's participation in the scramble for Africa extended its imperial lifespan by several decades, yet this renewed empire remained fragile, marked by contradictions between rhetoric and reality, ambition and capacity. The African colonies were geographically vast, socially diverse, and economically underdeveloped. Portuguese rule rested on coercion and dependency, not on genuine partnership or modernization. With the fall of the Portuguese monarchy in the year 1910 and the rise of the First Republic, Portugal entered a new political era at home, but the structure of its colonial empire remained largely unchanged. The new Republican government promised liberal reforms, education, and progress both in mainland Portugal and across the empire. However, its approach to colonial governance often reproduced the same authoritarian and exploitative patterns that had existed under royal rule. While the language of imperial legitimacy shifted from divine monarchy to national progress, the underlying logic of domination persisted. In Africa, Portugal continued to rule over Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde and Stay and Principe. In Asia, the small enclaves of Macau and Portuguese Tour remained, though their strategic and economic relevance had declined significantly. These overseas territories now formed the heart of the Portuguese Second Empire, a land-based resource extraction-focused empire that increasingly stood apart from the changing global mood of the early 20th century. One of the immediate challenges for the new republic was administrative control. The political instability that plagued Portugal throughout the First Republic, characterized by frequent changes of government, military coups, and internal dissent, limited the state's ability to reform or even consistently govern its colonies. Colonial administration was often left to local governors, private companies, and missionaries who operated with considerable autonomy and in many cases impunity. Despite Republican promises of modernization and equality, most African subjects remained disenfranchised. The vast majority were denied citizenship, education, or legal protection. A racial hierarchy persisted with white settlers and Portuguese officials, at the top mixed-race populations occupying ambiguous positions in the middle, and the African majority subjected to forced labor, taxation, and limited mobility. The system of indigenato or native status codified this inequality by placing natives under separate laws and restricting their access to civil rights. Education, while promoted rhetorically, remained scarce. Schools were largely run by Catholic missions and offered basic literacy and religious instruction. Access to secondary or higher education was rare for Africans, and the curriculum emphasized obedience, manual labor, and loyalty to the empire. The goal was not to foster intellectual development or critical thinking, but to create a class of low-level clerks, interpreters, and servants. Economically, the Portuguese colonies remained heavily oriented toward resource extraction. Angola became a center for coffee, cotton, and diamonds. Mozambique produced cashews, sugar, and tea, while also serving as a labor reserve for neighboring British territories. Guinea-Bissau exported peanuts and timber. These economies were shaped not by internal development, but by the demands of European markets and the interests of Portuguese companies. The labor system, nominally reformed under the Republic, continued to rely on coercion. Forced labor, whether labeled as taxation, public works, or obligatory service, remained widespread. African men were often conscripted for months at a time, separated from their families, and subjected to poor conditions and harsh discipline. Resistance took many forms, including desertion, sabotage, flight to neighboring colonies, and local revolts. Despite these pressures, African societies adapted and responded. In towns and villages, people built informal economies, preserved cultural traditions, and engaged in quiet acts of resistance. Christian churches, particularly those led by African pastors, became centers of community life and political discussion. In some regions, urbanization and wage labor gave rise to a small but growing African working class with connections to global labor movements and political ideologies. Meanwhile, the world was changing. The First World War, though centered in Europe, had consequences for the Portuguese Empire. Portugal joined the war on the side of the Allies in 1916 and deployed troops to fight in both Europe and Africa. In Angola and Mozambique, Portuguese forces clashed with German colonial troops, often involving African conscripts and porters who bore the brunt of the hardships. The war exposed the vulnerabilities of colonial control and disrupted economic production, while also heightening awareness of global political currents. After the war, the Treaty of Versailles confirmed Portugal's sovereignty over its African territories, but it also marked the beginning of new international scrutiny. The League of Nations and later the United Nations promoted ideas of self-determination and human rights, putting pressure on colonial powers to justify their rule. Portugal, however, remained committed to its imperial mission, framing it as a civilizing project rather than colonial domination. In the interwar years, African nationalism began to stir, albeit quietly. Educated elites in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau formed cultural associations, published newspapers, and engaged with ideas from Pan-Africanism, socialism, and anti-colonial movements elsewhere in the world. Though these early efforts were often limited in scope and repressed by colonial authorities, they laid the intellectual and organizational groundwork for future independent struggles. The Second World War further accelerated global shifts. Though Portugal remained officially neutral, the war disrupted trade, strained imperial logistics, and reshaped the balance of power. In the post-war period, decolonization swept across Asia and Africa. India gained independence from Britain in 1947. Ghana followed in 1957. One by one, colonial empires began to collapse. Portugal, however, resisted this tide. Unlike Britain or France, which sought gradual exit strategies or negotiated transitions, Portugal clung to its empire under the Estado Novo regime, a right-wing authoritarian dictatorship established by Antonio de Oliveira Salazar in the 1930s. The Portuguese state doubled down on its imperial identity. The colonies were rebranded not as territories but as overseas provinces, integral parts of the nation rather than foreign possessions. This rebranding did little to change the reality on the ground. Racial discrimination, economic exploitation, and political repression continued. In fact, under Salazar, censorship intensified, civil liberties were curtailed, and anti-colonial activism was harshly punished. African demands for rights or autonomy were labeled as communist or subversive and met with surveillance, arrests, and exile. By the mid-10th century, the contradictions were becoming unsustainable. While the rest of the world moved toward decolonization, Portugal insisted on maintaining a 19th-century vision of empire. The result would be a series of brutal colonial wars in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau that defined the final decades of Portuguese imperialism. As the millennia approached, Portugal stood increasingly alone among the imperial powers of Europe, while Britain, France, and others moved toward negotiated decolonization after the Second World War. Portugal doubled down on colonial rule. Under the dictatorship of Antonio de Oliveira Salazar and his Estado Novo regime, the Portuguese government clung to the belief that its overseas possessions were not colonies, but overseas provinces inseparable from the national territory. This refusal to adapt led to prolonged and bloody conflict that would ultimately break both the empire and the regime that defended it. The Estado Novo, or New State, had been established in the early 1930s following years of political instability in the Portuguese First Republic. Salazar, initially appointed as finance minister, soon consolidated control and established a corporatist authoritarian regime that emphasized order, Catholic values, and national unity. Censorship, secret police, and the suppression of political dissent became hallmarks of the regime both at home and across the empire. In Salazar's worldview, the Portuguese nation was multiracial and pluralistic continental. The colonies in Africa, Asia, and the Atlantic were portrayed as integral components of a timeless civilizational mission. Rather than being allowed to develop independent identities, the territories were expected to assimilate into a singular Portuguese cultural framework. Officially, there were no colonies, only provinces. This rhetorical move, however, masked a brutal reality of inequality, coercion, and political exclusion. By the late 1950s, this imperial fiction was coming under growing pressure. Across the African continent, nationalist movements were gaining strength. Educated elites, labor organizers, veterans, and intellectuals began forming political parties and liberation fronts demanding independence. These groups were often influenced by Pan-Africanist thought, Marxist ideology, and the examples of successful decolonization in places such as Ghana, India, and Indonesia. In Portuguese Africa, three main liberation movements emerged. Angola and the French National each vie for influence in Mozambique. The principal group was the Frente de Liberta de Mozambique of Limo, led by figures such as Eduardo Mondlane and later Samora Machel in Guinea. Bissau, the Partido Africano de Independencia de Cabo Verde Picchi, led by familiar cabal, organized a well-coordinated struggle. These movements, though differing in ideology and support bases, shared a common enemy, the intransigent Portuguese state. Initial demands for civil rights and autonomy were met with arrests, censorship, and crackdowns. When peaceful reform proved impossible, many groups turned to armed struggle supported by the Soviet Union, China, Cuba, and newly independent African states. The liberation movements began launching guerrilla campaigns against Portuguese colonial forces. The wars officially began in 1961, when an uprising in northern Angola resulted in the deaths of hundreds of Portuguese settlers and thousands of Africans in the violent response. That same year, India seized Goa, Daman, and Diu, Portugal's remaining enclaves in the subcontinent, dealing a humiliating blow to Lisbon's imperial pride. The next year, full-scale insurgencies erupted in Guinea, Bissau, and Mozambique. What followed was over a decade of relentless warfare known in Portugal as the Guerra do Ultramar or Overseas War. In Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau, Portuguese forces faced guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and sabotage in remote and difficult terrain. Despite being under-resourced compared to other European powers, Portugal committed hundreds of thousands of troops to the conflicts, including large numbers of conscripted soldiers. The cost was enormous. The wars drained the Portuguese economy, consumed more than half the national budget, and isolated Portugal diplomatically. The country remained under international sanctions and was condemned by the United Nations for its refusal to decolonize. Domestically, the regime maintained tight control, suppressing anti-war sentiment and outlawing political opposition. Yet, resistance within Portugal began to grow. The long duration of the wars, combined with the compulsory military service imposed on young men, created widespread disillusionment. Thousands of Portuguese citizens immigrated to avoid the draft or seek better opportunities abroad. Underground political movements, student protests, and dissident voices in the clergy began to challenge the moral and strategic justification for the empire. In the colonies, the cost was even higher. Entire regions were militarized. Villages were destroyed or forcibly relocated. Schools and hospitals were rare, and infrastructure existed mainly to serve the military or extractive industries. Meanwhile, the liberation movements gained legitimacy and support among the local populations. In Guinea-Bissau, the PIGC established liberated zones where it ran schools, clinics, and basic administration, earning international praise for its effectiveness. Salazar, increasingly old and ill, was succeeded in the late 1960s by Marcelo Caetano, who promised limited reforms, but remained committed to preserving the empire. The war continued with no clear end in sight. By the early 1970s, it had become Portugal's defining political crisis, one that neither military victory nor superficial reform could resolve. A crucial shift came not from the battlefield, but from within the Portuguese military itself. A group of younger officers, many of whom had served in Africa, grew disillusioned with the endless conflict and the rigid hierarchy of the regime. These officers, calling themselves the Movimento das Forças Armadas, MFA, began organizing in secret. On April 25, 1974, the MFA launched a peaceful coup in Lisbon known as the Revolões Craus or Carnation Revolution. The uprising quickly gathered popular support. Flowers, not bullets, were placed into the barrels of soldiers' rifles as civilians flooded the streets. Within hours, the Estado Novo collapsed and Caetano was removed from power. The revolution had multiple goals: restoring democracy, ending censorship, and expanding social rights. But central among them was ending the colonial wars. The MFA and the new transitional government immediately began negotiating with liberation movements across Africa. In a rapid succession, Portugal recognized the independence of Guinea, Bissau, Mozambique, Angola, and Cape Verde. Stay and Principe followed shortly thereafter. For Portugal, the sudden end of the empire was both liberating and traumatic. hundreds of thousands of settlers, soldiers, and mixed-race families known as ritorados fled to Portugal, overwhelming housing and social services. Politically, the country embarked on a turbulent transition to democracy. Yet for many, shedding the colonial burden opened the door to long-delayed modernization and integration into the broader European community. For the newly independent nations, the legacy of Portuguese rule presented immediate challenges. Infrastructure was limited, economies were distorted, and political systems were underdeveloped. In Angola and Mozambique, rival liberation movements turned on one another, plunging the countries into civil wars that lasted for decades. In Guinea, Bissau, and other former colonies, political instability, military coups, and economic hardship followed independence. Still, the end of the Portuguese Empire marked the final act in a long and complex imperial story. It was not a linear decline, nor a peaceful transition, but a rupture shaped by war, resistance, and a revolution born from within. When the Carnian Revolution of April in the year 1974 peacefully overthrew Portugal's Estado Novo regime, it not only ended nearly half a century of authoritarian rule, it also marked the beginning of the final phase of the Portuguese Empire. Within a matter of months, centuries of imperial rule across Africa unraveled. What followed was not just decolonization, but a complete transformation of Portugal's identity, economy, and place in the world. The imperial age was over, but its consequences would continue to shape both Portugal and its former colonies well into the 21st century. The new government, led by a transitional coalition of military officers and civilians, faced immediate pressure to dismantle the empire. The Movimento das Forças Armadas MFA, which had orchestrated the revolution, included many officers who had fought in the colonial wars and had grown disillusioned with the endless conflict. These soldiers, along with civil society and emerging political parties, demanded an end to the fighting and a redefinition of Portugal's national priorities. Portugal's new leadership initiated rapid negotiations with African liberation movements in Guinea, Bissau, which had already declared independence and controlled much of its territory. Formal recognition came almost immediately. Mozambique, led by the Marxist-oriented FIMO movement, was granted independence in June of the year 1975. Angola followed in November of that year, though its independence was quickly marred by a brutal civil war fueled by Cold War rivalries. Cape Verde and Principe also gained their independence in that same transformative year. This mass decolonization was remarkably swift and in many cases chaotic. Portugal had not prepared adequately for a peaceful transition. The sudden withdrawal of colonial administrators, military forces, and settlers left a vacuum of governance in the new nations. As many as 500,000 Portuguese citizens known as retodos returned to the mainland in a matter of months. Many arrived with few possessions. Overwhelmed by the loss of their homes, businesses, and status in the former colonies, the retro crisis had a deep social and economic impact on post-revolutionary Portugal. Housing shortages, unemployment, and integration challenges strained public services. At the same time, their presence accelerated certain reforms. Many retornados brought professional skills, entrepreneurial drive, and cultural diversity, contributing to a reorientation of Portuguese society toward Europe rather than its former empire. Meanwhile, in the newly independent African states, the departure of Portuguese rule offered both opportunity and hardship. While political sovereignty was achieved, the legacy of colonial neglect left many countries without the institutions necessary for stable governance. In Angola and Mozambique, rival factions that had once been united against the Portuguese now turned against one another. Civil wars erupted, fueled by Cold War competition, regional rivalries, and unresolved ethnic and ideological divisions. Portugal, though deeply affected by these events, was no longer an imperial actor. Instead, it focused inward on building a democratic system, repairing a stagnant economy, and redefining its international role. The new democratic constitution of 1976 enshrined civil liberties and broke definitively from the colonial ideology of the past. Portugal applied for membership in the European Economic Community, which it formally joined in the year 1986. This move signaled a clear pivot toward European integration and away from imperial nostalgia. Yet Portugal was not entirely finished with its overseas legacy. Two territories remained under Portuguese administration: East Timor and Macau. In East Timor, formerly known as Portuguese Timor, events took a tragic turn. In the aftermath of Portugal's withdrawal in 1975, East Timor declared independence. However, Indonesia invaded and occupied the territory within days, citing anti-communist concerns and regional security. What followed was a long and violent occupation marked by human rights abuses, forced displacement, and resistance by Timor's independence movements. Portugal never recognized Indonesia's annexation and advocated for East Timor's right to self-determination in international forums. It continued to work diplomatically through the United Nations to keep the issue on the global agenda. After years of struggle, East Timor finally gained independence in the early 21st century, with Portugal playing a key role in supporting the transition. The final chapter of the Portuguese Empire came in Macau. Unlike the violent or abrupt transitions elsewhere, the handover of Macau to China was negotiated over several decades. Portugal had maintained control over this small territory on the southern coast of China since the mid-6th century, operating under a complex arrangement of local autonomy and colonial administration. Throughout the 20th century, Macau had developed into a unique cultural and economic enclave, blending Portuguese governance, Chinese heritage, and international commerce. By the 1980s, both Portugal and China recognized the need for a formal resolution. In the year 1987, the two countries signed the joint declaration agreeing that Macau would be returned to Chinese sovereignty under a one-country, two-systems framework. On December 20, 1999, the transfer of Macau was completed. Portuguese flags were lowered, Chinese flags raised, and the last vestige of the Portuguese Empire officially came to an end. It marked the conclusion of one of the longest-lasting empires in world history, an imperial enterprise that had begun nearly 6 centuries earlier with the conquest of Ceuta and the voyages of Prince Henry the Navigator. In the years since, Portugal has sought to redefine its relationship with its former colonies. Diplomatic, cultural, and economic ties have been rebuilt through institutions like the Community of Portuguese Language Countries, CPL, established in the year 1996. Member states include Angola, Mozambique, Cape Verde, Guinea-Bissau, Stom and Principe, Brazil, East Timor, and Portugal itself. This organization promotes cooperation in education, culture, trade, and diplomacy, transforming old imperial relationships into partnerships based on shared language and mutual respect. Within Portugal, the memory of the empire remains a subject of debate, reflection, and sometimes controversy. Monuments to explorers and colonial administrators still stand in cities like Lisbon and Porto, while museums have begun reinterpreting the imperial past in light of modern perspectives on race, exploitation, and migration. Descendants of African, Brazilian, and Asian communities now form an integral part of Portuguese society, bringing with them the cultural legacies of a global past. The Portuguese Empire was never the largest or most populous of the European colonial empires, but it was the longest lasting. Its legacy spans continents from sugar plantations in Brazil to trading posts in India, from forts in Angola to missions in Japan. It shaped the modern world through its early role in globalization, its participation in the Atlantic slave trade, its missionary zeal, and its enduring linguistic and cultural footprint. As Portugal moved into the 21st century, it did so no longer as an imperial power, but as a democratic nation seeking reconciliation with its past and cooperation with its former territories. The age of empire was over, but the threads of that long history continue to bind people, cultures, and nations in unexpected ways.